I'll concede your point just for brevity. But
What? Brevity? We don't do that around here. It's probably
No.
citrus, or what is a Capital One Bowl? It used to be Citrus Bowl, right?
oh my
Capital
God,
One.
dude, where have you been?
I just like the real name.
It hasn't been the Citrus Bowl since like what 2002?
What was your highlight side dish from Thanksgiving?
Oh gosh, Scotch.
This is the Buck Around, the podcast devoted to all things Wisconsin Badger football from a fan perspective. Featuring your hosts, Richard Branch and Maxwell Brusky.
And hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Buck Around. Welcome back to episode 342 of the Buck Around. I am one half of said Buck Around, Richard Branch, joined by my attuned colleague, Maxwell Brusky. Max, how are you, sir?
Doing all right. Doing the work is what I'm doing.
I know, but ready at a moment's notice to record.
Yes.
Whatever, you get the kudos. So yeah, today, as I always like to say, it's not a duo, it is a trio, as we are joined by a very special guest, which I know we've mentioned the last couple pods, so this shouldn't be a surprise if you've been listening. And if you haven't been listening, what the hell's wrong with you? This is amazing content we put out. We are joined by the one and only Ryan Andersen of the Dairy Raid. Ryan, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. I'm a big fan, so I'm glad you're here. So thank you for gracing us
for having me. Fun to talk to you guys.
Well, you don't know that yet. You're just starting.
We'll see.
Yes, to be determined. So let's do this. As we said, going into this, you are the resident, and by resident, I mean in the sort of world of Badger online fandom expert. That's your residency, is the fandom thing. That was a very awkward way of saying it, but you know what I'm trying to get at. On the air raid offense and sort of the Venn diagram of people who also pay attention to Wisconsin football, that's you in there. So we thought it was great to bring you on for us as to do like a, what do we want to call this? I guess it's like a post-mortem at this point on the air raid. Yeah.
I mean, who knows? This could be the last official thing I do as the Dairy Raid, since there is no more raid in the dairy.
You could rebrand. This is an opportunity.
Well, nobody can spell my last name correctly, so I think we're just going to stick with the Dairy Raid and hope that Grimes incorporates it somehow.
But what's the
exactly.
deal with your name? We had a freaking head coach that, remember him?
Oh, people! Oh, trust me, I spend so much. Pay attention to anybody who mentions Gary Andersen to me on Twitter, and I'll be first to remind them. The guy that you're writing about right now is the former kicker of the Vikings, and not the coach because they spell it wrong.
Oh, that's even better.
And that's just the bane of my existence from when I was a small kid to I literally moved to the country of which my name is at the origin. So now nobody spells it wrong.
Well, there you go.
Good. That's good. And I say that from somebody who grew up in Racine.
Oh yeah,
yeah,
the number one by capita,
the home
Danish
of the Danish
population.
American. Yes.
Oh, really? All right. Well, while the two of you are doing geography and, I don't know, ethnography? Is that what that is? I don't even know what that is.
It's both.
Yes, of Wisconsin. I'm moving you two on. Let's get right to it here. And let's start with a really big, well, you know what? We want to go big question. We'll start a little bit smaller, but still a big question. And let's start talking about everybody's favorite quarterback. Let's start talking about Braden Locke. We're going to do a little rearview mirror and then we'll look ahead. What went wrong with Braden Locke? Like, I know from watching your stuff, it's like the line you brought up that it has stuck within my head for like the last 4 months or whatever it was when you first said it. It's like when a coach always mentions how heady a guy is, how smart he is, and never mentions, hey, he's got a big arm, it's because he does not have an arm. But, even taking that into account where it's like, okay, this guy has physical limitations, I still feel like there was a regression. Like literally he got worse as the year went on. And to Max's point, it's like there was a high watermark at the Penn State game, and that play of the year, as he called it, that pick six, it just felt like we just watched the water go down the drain. But tell me if we're right. Tell me if we're wrong. Give us your 20,000 words on Braden Locke.
Yeah, I think for me, the regression started in spring ball, because when we heard so much about the quote unquote quarterback competition between him and TVD, but then all you heard from Phil Longo was how TVD was fitting the ball in these tight windows. He had this big arm. Everyone talking about how big an arm he had. It's almost like Braden started overcompensating, because if you look at the windows he tried to throw the ball into this year, and you looked at the windows he tried to throw the ball into last year as an emergency backup coming in for an injury, he just tried to make throws that he shouldn't have been trying to make. And he should have stuck in his lane. And if you look at last year, he only had the one interception, 5 touchdown passes. The completion percentage wasn't the greatest, but he threw a couple just fantastic balls. So he has an accurate arm when he puts it in the framework of his arm strength. And there were a couple passes I know of, like I believe Northwestern, his interception against Northwestern, where nobody's like, where is he trying to throw the ball? I think he's trying to throw it to Pauling. Maybe he's throwing it to CJ, but it just kind of ends up zipping between the two of them. And so I'm just sitting there trying to diagnose. It's like, okay, well, if he's trying to throw it here, I can see what he's looking at, but he doesn't have the arm strength for this, but he's trying to force it. And I think that coupled into the fact that what usually happens with Badger quarterbacks is when teams start to being able to shut down the run, and which happened, post Locktober, the running game pretty much went away, and Braden Locke turned into every Badger quarterback not named Russell Wilson, and to lesser extents like Scott Tolzien and Jack Cohn. And we just got good old-fashioned mediocre Wisconsin QB play against way better teams than we're used to playing in November. And it just spiraled.
Let me ask you one specific follow-up there, because it's something you said, and I had to write it down because I wanted to circle back to it. If you were Phil Longo, what is Braden Locke's lane? Like, what's the lane for Braden Locke?
And Rich, that's exactly the question I was going to ask too, because now that Locke's out of the program, Phil Longo's out of the program, now the head coach at Sam Houston State, and I wonder if the Locke brothers will wind up at Sam Houston State, or what, like not just what is his lane, like what kind of offense would he excel at? And you touched on a great point too, that he was overcompensating. And when things aren't going well, there's always this tendency to psychoanalyze people from the outside. I don't know what Braden Locke's like in person. I don't, but I think you're right. You can tell there's a push there. So I think, that's both of our questions too, is what, not only what is his lane, but then what I was going to ask too is where would he find success? Because he's obviously got some raw ability. I
mean, he would fit in an air raid offense if he had a coordinator who would kind of focus on the passes that he's good at. He's good at the intermediate, up the seam, slant, quick out. We're not trying to force the ball down the post. We're not trying to force the ball down the field on the sideline. There's hundreds of successful air raid quarterbacks who did not have big arms. You look at Mike Leach. 75% of his quarterbacks he had at Texas Tech did not have down the field arms. They just knew how to spread the ball around, or spread the route structure around that created space. So maybe not following Phil Longo to Sam Houston, but something like Texas State, where they have an air raid head coach, a team like that who is going to work more spacing, sideline to sideline, the horizontal spacing than the vertical spacing. And also a team that's not going to rely on him to be the guy to push the ball downfield. He needs to be he needs to be the air raid equivalent of a game manager. And when he was asked to be more than the game manager, well, we saw what happened.
So let me ask you this along those lines. The other thing that was weird about him this year that really jumped out, and it sticks in my head on one of many Tucker Ashcraft sort of questionable non-receptions, is this sort of thing where I saw Locke kind of break down mechanically this year a little bit, but then also there were times where there was one throw he's making, and if I'm to use the PS5 sort of analogy, he's mashing that circle and he is bulleting everything, right? Like everything was, and if it was a 15 foot throw, not even 15-yard throw, it's flying. Is that just a guy where the game's getting too fast? Is that panic? What is that? Because we talked about the look on this pod, and I just feel like it's all tied.
Yes,
I think so. Yeah, his work through the progression really ebbs and flows this year. Where early in the year, it really seemed like he was just rushing. Like he wouldn't give routes time to establish himself. And he's just like, I'm going to get rid of the ball as fast as I can. I think the USC game was a perfect example of that, where if he would have waited a millisecond longer at the top of his drop, another route was going to open for more yards and he wouldn't, have to throw the ball into tight coverage. Then those windows started to tighten up. And then instead of worrying about placement, when he started pushing the ball downfield, he just like, I'm going to try to throw the ball as hard as I can and prove to these people that I have a stronger arm. I don't know if I don't know if he reads his own press, but it sure seemed like it, where he was really just trying to force the ball. And there's a difference between having a strong arm and having arm strength. Like you can throw a good, hard, catchable ball and not have the biggest arm in the world, but you can also throw the ball 1,000 miles an hour with perfect accuracy and it can't be caught. And I think that's where he kind of sit himself in between. He couldn't figure out which one he wanted. And early in the season, it was about getting rid of it fast. And later in the season, it was getting there as hard as I could.
Man, we're going to, the next question we kind of had on the agenda is about the run game and how it was so inconsistent. But like the more like we're talking here, and this is a lot of it was apparent during the season. And I think this was a lot of the identity question, as far as Locke, it just seems like he's a square peg in a round hole in this whole thing. And his coordinator did him no favors, and his head coach did him no favors. And this whole thing was a square peg in a round hole. I mean, what would you comment on that, Mr. Dairy Raid?
I think the philosophy, if we want to look philosophically about the air raid, it fits any offense. The idea of getting the ball in space, creating horizontal and vertical stresses, that's every offense. Whether you want to agree, whether people want to agree with it or not, is that. The way that, and within, if you want to look at the play structure of the air raid, I just think the way that Phil Longo decided to run the air raid didn't match because he was asking. I mean, I saw it in the launch last year where it's like these receivers, like Chimere Dike couldn't break press coverage if his life depended on it. And then he didn't know what to do when he got to the top of his route. He was asking so much of the receivers that they just didn't get it. And his answer to that, which is what a lot of coaches who kind of fall within a philosophy do, is like, well, no, it works. Just do it. It works. Trust me, it works. Just keep doing it. And it's not like he didn't dumb it down, but there's things he could have done that it could have simplified things without getting away from his core route structure and stuff like that. He decided, no, forget that. This stuff worked for me everywhere as I went. You guys are the problem, and it just never worked out. And I think that was just, he was the wrong fit. The offense maybe was a wrong fit. I mean, it's a big step up to go from a pass when you need to a pass as an integral part of your offense type of offense. And jumping in feet first to go from the quote unquote pro style to Phil Longo's air raid it was too big of a leap in the terms of modernizing offenses. In fact, I think the offense we're going into this year would have been the better springboard to go from Paul Chryst. If you went Paul Chryst to Jeff Grimes to Phil Longo, that would have been a way better transition than what obviously we saw now.
Let me ask you one last thing looking back on the offense, because you touched on it there. How much of the issue do you think was the receiving core? I'm really curious. And of the receivers they used regularly in rotation, who do you think understood it the best and was sort of operating within it the best?
Will Pauling definitely understood it.
Yeah.
And they used him in many different type of routes. And you could see that Phil Longo was scheming to get him open at different points of the field because he was the one who really got it. I think Bryson Green understood his role as that receiver because coming from Oklahoma State, they ran air raid adjacent offense as well. But I mentioned last year, Chimere Dike never got it. You could tell he was used to tell me where I need to go. Just how many steps, how many yards, what angle, tell me where to go. And I think CJ Williams was a lot like that. I think the second he got a fingernail touched on him, he just got completely off target and could not get himself open. He was great in getting himself open when he didn't have anybody in front of him, but put somebody in front of him, his brain just did not compute. Vinny Anthony was getting better towards the end. I think he could have developed with another year in the system. He could have been even better. I think there was a couple poor decisions by Braden that were kind of caused by, or the start of was waiting for Vinny Anthony to decide how many steps he was going to take in his release to get going. So yeah, I think it was just a big mismatch of hardware and software. I think you had a bunch of receivers who were bred to play in one offense, being told exactly what to do. And Phil Longo expected them to feel where they fit. feel the read, feel where they're supposed to sit down, find the space. And then the quarterback's job to throw it into the space, because that's a big thing with the air raid as well. Air raid quarterback coaches, offensive coordinators, they don't teach their quarterbacks to read coverage. In fact, like going back to Hal Mummy, he specifically tells quarterback, I don't want to hear you talking about coverage. I want you to throw to open space. When you get to the top of your drop, is the open. And that was a big problem, is the receivers couldn't get themselves open at the top of the drop and could never get in rhythm with the quarterbacks. And the offense is 100% built on rhythm. And without the rhythm, you couldn't do it. And it just didn't work.
Well, so here's another part of that too. This the other component, or the next question, talk about it before, is the run game. Like, that's done a certain way in air raid, and it's something that certainly the Wisconsin legacy wasn't not used to, or like you said, with hardware and software, what came into what was left in the program, and especially offensive linemen, just as much tight ends and the back and the quarterback. If you looked at it, it looked like nothing like what fans had been used to seeing, or opposing teams had been used to seeing. What kind of comments do you have as far as the running game? And if you use square peg and round hole again, that's totally fine.
Well, I think with the run game, the schemes didn't change much. They're still running the same power scheme. They're still running the same outside zone. A lot of things are the same, but it's the idea of lighter boxes, bigger splits, and stuff like that. And when you have a bunch of guys who are bred to block inside of a phone booth, now you're introducing space to them that they're not used to. Now you're introducing rushers who are coming from different angles. And I think we saw, Jack Nelson last year was a definite example of that. He just had no idea how to occupy or work himself in space. And so, and you take on top of that with Wisconsin running backs, this is the first time in a very long time that we didn't have a generational running back leading our rushing attack. And, I jokingly talk about the Hornibrook line of, Wisconsin quarterbacks were asked to go 12 for 20 for 150 yards, a touchdown and an interception. And they had a running back who put up a $130 and a touchdown every week. We don't have that anymore. We didn't have that even with Braylon Allen, and last year as well. So when you can't rely on your offense to be run by a bell cow running back, and that's your identity, well, it's not going to work. And then they tried to transition away from it, and it worked even less. And so part of it's on the offensive line, not, again, mismatch. You've got linemen who are used to just being in tight spaces and using brute force, where now most offenses are designed to, we want to bring brute force into space, and we want to let the running backs find gaps. It's how modern football is changing. And I think with the way that they're recruiting offensive linemen now, you're getting size, but they're athletic. And that's going to help us going forward, especially if we're going to be running the wide zone.
Well, before we move on, what would you, is the talent that they had there? Obviously not. It's not Jonathan Taylor. It's not Melvin Gordon. But what do you make of the talent that they had there this year? And then we'll talk about what the future looks like with Grimes. But would the talent have been okay as far as the running backs themselves in a different? I guess if things would have been different, I don't know what I'm trying to say, but because we were pretty confident going into the year that we had a nice running back room, even though there wasn't a Jonathan Taylor there.
I mean, I love Tui Walker. I loved how he ran. I think he fit the offense well. It just seems like he ran out of gas towards the second half of the season. And he needed that complementary running back to work as a 1-2 tandem. And unfortunately, Ches, he just wasn't it anymore. You could tell when he came back, whether his injuries caused hesitation by physical limitations or mental limitations, he just couldn't be that number 2 guy. That pair that could work together. And K. Yakimelli had his strong suits. I don't think he was ever going to be an every down kind of back. And because he had similar limitations where he has one run scheme where he's really good at. Now, luckily, that's going to fit Jeff Grimes really well because that's what Grimes runs. But I think, they just did not have consistency where you had a number 1 guy who could have the gas and the strength to pound out 20 carries, and then another guy who can get you 10, 15 on the back end and keeping the same quality level up. Because even, again, you go back to Melvin Gordon had Corey Clement, James White had Melvin Gordon, Monte Ball had Melvin Gordon, and we can keep going back. It's
Yes, I
every
know.
every big, feature back we had another guy right behind him. And we had Braylon Allen, who was okay, but he always seemed to be injured or dinged up or whatever. And then his number two, well, Ches could have been that guy. He always got hurt, and he had injury, bad luck.
Yeah.
Not necessarily injury prone. And then this year we just didn't have either. I think Toby Walker, I think like everybody, he hit the peak in October and then just ran out of gas in the rest of the season.
October. That's awesome.
So
I forgot about that.
yeah, you led me into with that my question, sort of thinking about this offense. It kind of became obvious, like I didn't really so much buy into it at the time, but obviously I was kind of wrong about it. But that there was a core tension between what Longo wanted to do, what Fickell wanted him to do, and their butting heads. And you just kind of saw weird sort of swings, like the 7-man running back room that became a 2 or a 3. I mean, almost a 3, and all this stuff kind of going back and forth. I think also some of the installation of the under center stuff was from Fickell, sort of too Longo. But do you feel like one guy was more right than wrong? Or is it just you got to sort of have like it's too many cooks in the kitchen? Or if you were the two of them together, how would you have sort of done this differently to navigate this year, knowing what the limitations were of the team?
Yeah, I think, you could hear some of the comments that Phil Longo gave at times. I'm here
Right.
at the behest of Luke Fickell. To me, that's just basically him waving the white flag and saying, I give up. Fine, coach, here you go. You're going to get what you want. And as an offensive-minded coach with a defensive-minded head coach, I think Phil Longo needed to be stronger. Be like, let me do what you hired me to do. But also Luke Fickell needed to be more upfront with what his vision was for the offense fitting into his program. I'll give Luke Fickell credit for hiring Phil Longo, going way outside of his comfort zone, but he went outside his comfort zone and tried to make Phil Longo fit his comfort zone. And that didn't work. And I think Phil Longo should have pushed harder to be like, let me try to do what I want to do. Could that have been Luke Fickell saying, well, your stuff's not working. Why don't we go back to this? You could definitely, I think a lot of the personnel management came from Fickell. I think that's where he thought the problem was. The inconsistencies were that, well, you gotta let him warm up in a game. You got to give him a bunch of carries to get guys to work in. I think what the problem was is there's two ways where you can see running back by committee. You can go 50-50, trying to get just basically equal reps, rotating drives, or you can be like, all right, got my first and second down guy. He's going to pound between the tackles. I've got my third down back. He's going to catch passes. He's going to pass block. I've got my change of pace, scat back, put him in the slot every now and then. That kind of would have worked way better. And it's something that I thought they were going to do when they talked about running back by committee. They just early in the season, they decided we're going to go split carries. And then towards the end of the year, we're going to split carries, but it's going to be between the bruiser and Tui Walker and the freshmen who have totally different running styles. That just didn't work out.
Well, to that point too, I mean, for what it's worth, you saw it all the time on Twitter and responses to your stuff. And, we get calls on it every time. Like, what happened to Cade Giacomelli? I don't, it's kind of a mystery. And he's not somebody who's hit the transfer portal right away. I mean, he may yet, but I think a lot of people would have thought he would have been right there with Leon Lowry on day one.
If I were to guess what if I look at it, basically, I think what they saw was that he was Tui Walker's direct backup. And when they went away from splitting carries, you got the feature back and he does what he needs to do. And then you have the third down back. And Darian Dupree was the third down back. He's also younger, faster, more dynamic.
Mm-hmm.
He can offer more. Cade Giacomelli has a very good, he's fast. He makes nice cuts. He can catch the ball a little bit, but he has some things that he's good at. And unfortunately, it's the same skill set that Tui Walker's working with, and just built a little bit differently. So that's probably where it ended up being. It's like, well, if we're gonna go feature back and try to tighten things up, well, then the backup's not going to get as many reps. And I guess they didn't see as much value with him in the passing game or see value with him as a change of pace, because he wasn't really so much a change of pace. When they ran outside zone with him, he was a great guy to get in there, put his foot in the ground and hit the gap and go for it, which again, well, I think maybe one of the reasons why he hasn't transferred is he fits Jeff Grimes' vision of a running back, because the blocking scheme is exactly what he wants to run. And Jeff Grimes is totally cool with running outside zone 30 times in a game. Katie Akameli is going to love that. And I think it's going to fit fine for him.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I figured too. It's just that, I mean, that was kind of a topic, especially if you had Tilly Walker running out of gas. Because I agree with you that towards the end of it, and a lot of people, and I'm not trying to sound like I carry a torch for the guy, but it was a lot of the commentary from the fan base is, why didn't you see him? I think it's an excellent transition to talking about Grimes. I think you touched on it already that going from Christ to Grimes to an air raid would have been a lot easier transition than you're going to Chris to Longo air raid. You've got content out there. So for folks that, I don't want you to, give away anything here too much for free, but I mean, as far as as Grimes, what did you think of that? And were you surprised? And was that somebody that you thought might be in the mix? I know you did have a, who's going to be the coordinator kind of thing, but it seems to me that nobody was talking about Grimes that much, but he seems to me like he fits pretty well to me. I'm pretty happy with it. I don't know what's going to happen, but I count me in the, oh yeah, that looks like a good hire category.
I think the more and more I look into it, the more and more I watch the film, the more I'm okay with it scheme wise. I got to maybe dig more into him as a play caller and more into him as, how he builds the offense. I hadn't thought about him because I assumed they were going to go quarterback coach type OC. So I hadn't even considered him. You make a video with 10 candidates and he's definitely not one of them. But he is, he's a candidate that if you just look at what he runs, should appease the fans, should appease the sweater vest wearing run the ball crowd. He does that old school stuff with an eye to how modern football is run at the college level. I kind of see it as he runs a more simplified college version of the Shanahan offense.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Outside zone, play action off outside zone. It incorporates the jet sweep, incorporating the tight ends. A lot of movement, a lot of shifts, a lot of motions. I think he's going to carry that with him from Kansas here. And I think it fits the personnel that we have in the program already, because it's going to be less about, all right, I want you to go in this general direction and feel where you need to sit down. It's like, all right, no, you're going to run a 12-step post. You're going to run a 15-yard out. It's a lot more structured, traditionally a little simpler maybe, but they use the moving parts to kind of make something that's simple look a little more complicated. And I think that's going to fit in well.
I'm going to jump you a little bit, Rich, because as you're talking about that, and when you said Shanahan, it sounds to me like there's going to be another offensive convergence between Wisconsin and Iowa with Tim Lester. Is that accurate?
God, I hope. Well, God hope not. I think
because Lester does a lot of the same stuff, and he spent all that time with Matt LaFleur.
And again, it's the it's like Jeff Grimes. Like, he doesn't have connections to the Shanahan tree.
Mm-hmm.
His connection to pro ball is Dirk Cutter, who, sure, long time offensive coordinator in the NFL, was a head coach at Boise State when he was at Boise State, Arizona
back in the
State.
Playoff with Boise State now.
And I put a little note on that. If you look at Boise State's offense this year, Genty, that's one thing, mm-hmm, but the structure of how they do things, you could bring that to Wisconsin and be successful. Recruiting similar type talent. I think he'd fit in. He has pro style sensibilities, but he knows how to structure it within a college offense. And that's what's important.
So let me ask you something, because you got my mind thinking about this when you were talking about sort of simplifying the offense and specifically the route tree. What makes you think, put yourself in the mind of Will Pauling and CJ Williams? Is it just, I don't want to learn a new system on the back end of my career? Is that what it is? Because I feel like they're guys, I feel like especially for CJ, quite frankly, doesn't have it exactly a bountiful amount of film to advertise yourself. I feel like he might actually do well in an offense like that.
I think for sure Will Pauling. I think that is definitely why he's moving on. They talk with Tretch that they were going to have 3 receivers and the best 3 receivers were going to play. That means one of those slots was going to end up on the outside, and it was probably going to be Pauling, because Tretch is going to be the Deebo Samuels of this offense. I think he's going to fit really well. Look at Kansas film and look at Luke Grimm. That's going to be Tretch, and I think he's going to fit in really well.
He's electric too. I mean, he's one of those guys that when he touches the ball, it's you can feel it. He's electric.
And I think they're gonna scheme him open so much more this year. I think CJ Williams, they're just basically telling me like, you know what, we're probably gonna play the younger guys ahead of you. We really like Eugene Hilton. We're probably gonna bring in a transfer. I think they were honest with him and told him you're probably not going to get a lot of playing time because he didn't show much in the 2 years he was here. And why sometimes we need to temper our expectations when we see ratings, especially former. And any ratings on a player where we hear former 4-star. They were a 4-star 3 years ago. They're not anymore. They are what they are now. And what we've seen what we're going to get out of CJ Williams. I don't think in year 4 in college football he's going to improve much. So a fresh start, probably at a slightly lower level, is going to be good for him. I wasn't necessarily sad to see him leave because he didn't contribute much. No. Will Pauling, I am sad to see him leave, but I understand. I think he found his niche. He found what worked for his playing style in that type of offense. They're moving away from it. Ask him to play a different position. Probably it was the right time to move on.
All right. I was just going to actually ask you about the running backs as well, because I think I get what you mean about Cade Yakimelli. Like if you're running an outside zone, it's basically they're going to stretch and then he's going to cut back, right? Against the grain. And he seems like that's what he is. He's that cut. He always reminds me of Isaac Garendo. It's like a one cut guy and a lot of straight line speed. Is that what you mean? Like that kind of player?
For sure. For sure. He was definitely way better at the one cut reads than he was either a gap scheme where he had to follow blockers to get into a gap. He would always kind of pitter patter in the gap and take too many steps. But you just basically say, all right, aim for the tight end, keep stretching, put your foot in the ground once you see the guard's butt turn to you. He was perfect at that because there's no thinking involved. It's just see and react. But when he had to think, he never quite got comfortable. Maybe because he doesn't have, he came into Wisconsin as a safety or as an athlete, I guess. He hadn't originally been brought in to be a running back. So maybe he doesn't just have the natural instincts that a running back would have. But with outside zone, and especially how it's taught, it's hard to read it wrong. And I think he'll fit in really well with that.
Yeah, no, what I was going to say, and this goes for Cade Yakimelli too, and the reason that I brought him up is just because there was a lot of talk about it. And, when he did stuff, he looked pretty good. And people think, well, geez, why don't you play him more? The CJ Williams thing. And I think Braden Locke's like this too. I would talk to people about Braden Locke, and he, if I'm not mistaken, he has Texas State high school record. And he played in the top level of Texas high school football, was really successful in the Dallas Metro, the DFW Metroplex. I think just a lot of frustration was a lot of these. I don't know if you call it misevaluations. CJ Williams was a former 4-star recruit. Why couldn't he have been Robert Woods, or why couldn't he have been George Farmer, or on and on? I think of Braden Locke. Why don't you get Drew Brees or Matthew Stafford that had pretty similar high school pedigrees? But Yakimelli's is kind of the same thing, where you look at it and you just have to look a little bit closer, I think. And I think that's a lot of the source of frustration, and a lot of the content that you provide, which is a long way of me giving you an advert, is that you do have to look a little bit deeper.
It's always been that way. It's like, how many, look at the vaunted 2021 recruiting class and the stars that those guys have. And you don't want to go straight to that it was a misevaluation of the talent. The talent's there, but it's applying the talent to a new level, to new responsibilities, to a new environment. Sometimes it just doesn't work out. And at the same tone, that's where you can get guys coming in as walk-ons who leave Madison as All-Americans. Right. Because somebody missed, maybe there's a misevaluation. Maybe there was a growth spurt. Maybe, there's a lot of factors. And so that's why I try not to get excited until I see them playing college football against college level players. That's why Daniel Neal coming in, I'm more confident in him than maybe Metoyer, just for the fact that I've seen him play college football. Mm-hmm. And he did okay. And I try not to put too much stake into stars and how the guys did at camps. And because a lot of times these guys coming out of high school, they were the guy.
Yep.
So of course they look And if anybody's played high school football with a guy who I played against Justin Ostrowski when he was a freshman,
Sure.
and he ran me over on a kickoff. And he was just a mountain compared to what, I was used to playing against in South Central Wisconsin back then. And then he went to Madison, he did nothing because he got hurt. And it's just what it is sometimes.
Let me ask you one thing, because you got me right into what I wanted to ask about.
Yes.
What do you think, and since we're looking at committed portal quarterbacks, I'm not investing too much in it until they actually get to signing day and somebody doesn't move on. What is the logic, aside from this is probably what they can afford in the NIL world? What's the logic in Billy Edwards and Danny O'Neil? Like, what do you see? I know you did a video on Danny O'Neil I haven't watched yet, but what do you see as a common thread with those guys that, okay, these are the guys we're doing, aside from laddering scholarships?
I think, looking at both of them so far, they've got quick releases. They can move. They can be both a part of the QB run game. They can move the pocket. They can be the new school game manager. And I think that's what this offense needs right now as a transition. They don't need it. They don't need a guy who has to go out and be the guy to win games. They need a guy who's going to go out there and facilitate winning by taking care of the football, moving the pocket, running the offense, being under control. That's a step that we need to get back to, and then build towards guys who can take the game over later down the line. I think Billy Edwards is going to be fine for that. I mean, I think we can all agree, as sad as it was, we would trade his season last year for anything this year, and call it a success. And I think he'll do fine.
I think that, is it the idea you're looking for a quarterback who isn't losing you games anymore, but you're not looking for a quarterback who's necessarily winning games at this point? It's the Jack Cohn.
I want a quarterback that, if we're going to have a run first offense, he can facilitate, he can be the manager, he can do the play action, he can move the pocket.
Okay.
And then when teams do what most teams do, and eventually, like, all right, we're going to crowd the box and force the quarterback to beat us, I want him to have enough ability that he can throw a ball in a one-on-one situation. Like stepping up from the Alex Hornibrookes and the Joel Staves of the world to Jack Cohn. Cohn would be fine.
And it's all the stuff that Russell Wilson did with, like, the thing that made him special. That, okay, that's great if you have that, but he did all those other things superlatively, as far as his working of the play action, his moving of the pocket, the quarterback run game. And he was mobile. He wasn't a speedster or anything like that, not a run first guy, but he had a lot of rushing yards. That's I think, if you could do that, and get to that level of all the things that a good to great college quarterback can do, fine. If you get the special parts of Russell Wilson, great. That'd be icing on the cake, but it's icing on the cake. You need the cake.
Yeah, I think if as long as these guys can just be in a situation where it's 9 guys in the box, he can make a throw. We had, for years we had quarterbacks who could not make throws in situations where we needed them to, and take any kind of pressure away from the offense or from the running game. So we need a running game that can hold the offense, can move us downfield, can be what we rely on. But when things go wrong, we need a quarterback who can make a play every now and then.
Yep.
And that's important. And whether it be with his feet or with his arms. And if you can do both, which looks like both of these guys can do a little bit, and Carter Smith looks like he can do on film, maybe Matt Toyer looks like he could do it on film as well, it's moving in the right direction.
All right, fair enough.
Yep.
All right. I think we promised you we'd have you out at the top of the hour, and we're over. So
that's fine.
Before we let you go, Ryan, I think there's a lot of overlap in our audience and yours, but just in case, if people want to find you, where do they find you? Tell us.
The Dairy Raid everywhere is basically. I'm not going to change it, even though we're not running the air raid anymore. Like I said to you guys, nobody can spell my last name correctly, so I'm not going to brand after myself. So Twitter, YouTube, Substack, it's all there. I occupy the niche inside the niche that is Badger football. So yeah.
All right.
If you like watching me rewind film back and forth, I got a lot of good stuff.
So for those who are curious,
Rich does the same thing.
Yes, at the Dairy Raid on Twitter. Just look up Dairy Raid on YouTube. You're listening to a subscriber, and there's a Substack out there, so go find him. Ryan, you were great. Thank you for coming on. Yeah, especially I'm very impressed with all of us pulling this together very quickly. So again, thanks, man. We really appreciate it.
Yes.
Welcome.
Yes, indeed.
All right, Max, we won't do a post-mortem here because we have just done a post-mortem before hitting the record button.
It's just like a meta postmortem.
Yeah, I thought you were going to say metapausal.
Second order postmortem.
I mean, if we were going to be menopausal, I'd be a little more worried. But yeah, so we just figured, just to give everybody a heads up, you and I are disappearing, I don't know, what do we want to call it, into our holiday season cocoon?
Winter break.
Yes. We'll be back after the New Year's, that week of like the 5th or 6th. We'll do a Portal show. Like, that's really the only thing that's going on. We're going to see the Portal finish up. And we learned last year not to talk about Portal players halfway through because, they're going to change. But we'll do sort of a recap of all of that week. We won't be as timely as others, but we'll be so insightful you won't mind, right?
Oh, yeah, totally.
So on that note, until the next year, Max?
Until the next year, Merry Christmas and to a happy, safe, and prosperous 2025.
There you go. Bye-bye, everybody.
Enjoy the conversation? Head on over to buckaroundpodcast.com to find all the ways to connect with the show, links to our Patreon page, and feeds for every major podcasting platform. We want to thank each and every one of our patrons. You make this podcast possible. This has been The Buck Around, Badger football analysis from a fan perspective.